Thank you so much for joining us at Hillside Community Church. We are starting a brand new series today. It's entitled Less Than Perfect. Before we jump into it today, let me go ahead and put that up there for you. That's our outline. So if you want to write those things down, take some notes as we go along, it'll be great if you did that. All right, I'm going to start off with a little personal story. This past week, my wife, Beth, and I spent some time with some friends on a lake. Now, Beth and I both love to fish, and, well, she loves being out in the sun. So, this past week, the weather was great for both. So we got up one morning and we went out and got in the boat and went across the lake. And we stopped over a spot where we knew the fishing was always good. And this time, well, it was no exception. It was a beautiful day. The fish finder was all lit up. There was fish all around us. So we dropped anchor and we started catching fish almost instantly. However, after about 20 minutes or so, we noticed we weren't catching as many fish. We were still casting the same way. We're using the same bait, but just no real success. And that's when we realized that we were no longer in the sweet spot. We had drifted and we hadn't even noticed. There was no real wind to speak of, so we were a little confused. And that's when we realized that our anchor had not grabbed onto anything solid. And so as a result, we were drifting away from where we wanted to be. And it took a little effort to get us back to the right spot, but once we did, well, the fishing picked right back up. Sometimes that's how it can be in life. We stop paying attention. We begin to drift, and that's when everything becomes a little less than perfect. See, the problem with spiritual drifting is the exact same thing. As you probably know, it never takes us closer to God. When we drift in any area of our life, without exception, it always takes us further away from God and His purposes. And unfortunately, just like on that day of the lake, we often don't realize how far we have drifted until it's too late. Well, I don't believe for a second that there are believers who wake up one day and simply say, you know what, I think I'm going to drift away from the Lord today. No, believers don't do that. Yet over time, through compromise, through distraction, or sometimes just plain forgetfulness, we can end up far away from where we started. And we find ourselves wondering how we got so far away from God. Well, that's exactly what happened to the nation of Israel. God's people did not fall away in one big moment. No, they slowly drifted away. They forgot. They got distracted. And that led to compromise. Well, as a result, over time, they ended up in chaos and they were constantly looking for God to rescue them again and again. Well, fortunately, there is some good news that comes out of their experience. God does not drift from us. In fact, God never moves. He is the same yesterday, today, forever. So when we anchor ourselves to Him, it is a strong anchoring point. And even when we pull up our anchor, He pursues us, He restores us, and He seeks to accomplish His will in us. Well, that's what this series is all about. Even though we are less than perfect, God is faithful, even when His people drift. Now, as we do with most of our series, we have a memory verse for this series. It's Paul's writing in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. This is verses 14 and 15. It says, "For the love of Christ controls us, having concluded this, that one died for all. Therefore all died. And He died for all. Why? So that they who live might no longer live for themselves, but for Him who died and rose again on their behalf." Now, this verse tells us that when we maintain a deep understanding of the cross, that's one of the main things that will keep us from drifting. And one of the best ways to stay close to God is by learning some lessons from those who were less than perfect. Today, as we start this series, I want to talk about a generational drift that happened in Israel's history. A generational drift is a reality, honestly, that none of us can avoid. And we know this from what Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 4. He says, a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. You see, as generations come and go, there's going to be what's known as overlap. But there's also going to be some changes that occur. In America today, the researchers claim that there are currently 6 generations that are alive and coexisting. However, each generation grew up or is growing up in a different world from the previous generation. For example, the world that I grew up in was much different from my parents' generation. And the world my grandchildren are going to grow up in will be much different from my generation. And the same holds true for us in our lives as believers. As believers, we understand that while generations will change, God and the gospel does not. And that's why it's imperative that we ensure that those eternal truths, the gospel, is passed on from one generation to the next. And because this is so important, we've made it the main focus of today's lesson. In fact, this is the first set of blanks in your notes. Faith is one generation from extinction. That's right. And as we're going to read in the book of Judges, it is possible for an entire generation to drift from God. And while seeing just one child drift from God is heartbreaking, seeing a whole generation drift from God, well, that would be catastrophic. And that's why our children's ministry here at Hillside has some specific values. And one of the main things that we preach is that we plant now so that we can harvest later. That's one of the main reasons that we continue to exist as a church. That's here locally. And it's also ties in with being called to bring up children in the direction of God. Well, here at Hillside, we want to help as many children as possible become committed followers of Christ. And unless we pass on the faith, well, a whole generation will be lost. And that's a lesson that we're going to learn today from Israel's history. Clearly, faith is one generation from extinction. Our text today is Judges chapter 2. We're going to look at verses 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We'll probably look at 11 as well. So as you're finding that passage, let me give you a little background information. The book of Judges records a very dark period in Jewish history. It gives us insight to a period when the Israelites drifted from their faith and from being obedient to God. And as a result, this drifting led to repeated cycles of disobedience, discipline, and ultimately, we'll see today, deliverance. Now, despite the title of the book, these were not judges the kind of judges that you think of today. No, these were military leaders that God raised up to deliver the Israelites from their enemies. Well, that was then. So today, the book of Judges provides insights for us into our human condition. And what we're going to see is that this book demonstrates our continued propensity perhaps to drift from God. And it's also going to show us the need we have for his divine intervention and guidance. The book of Judges can be divided into 3 main categories. Here they are. In the first couple of chapters there, we call it the prologue. And there it sets the stage for the events that follow. It highlights Israel's tendency to drift from God and then their subsequent idolatry. The middle section, chapters 3 through 16, are where we see the deeds of the judges. And this section recounts the lives and the actions of 12 prominent judges. And then the last section of the book, the epilogue, this is a general overview of the moral climate during the time of the judges. It shows us the social and the moral decay within Israel. And today, as we start this series, we're going to see that faith is clearly one generation from extinction. Our first point today focuses on what we're going to call the faithful generation. Yes, there was a generation that was faithful to God. And this generation didn't just know about God. No, they knew God. And they knew him through personal experiences. Well, Joshua was one of those people. You see, after Moses led the people out of Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, spent 40 years in the desert, prior to entering into the promised land, and after Moses died, Joshua became not just the civic and the military leader, but became the spiritual leader of the people. And after he led the people into the promised land and ultimately subdued it, in verse 6 of our text, we read the following. When Joshua dismissed the people, the sons of Israel went each to his inheritance to possess the land. Now, just for clarity, this is what's known as a flashback. Okay? According to Judges 1:1, Joshua is already dead. So what we see here is that the writer of the book of Judges is reminding the readers of who Joshua was and pretty much what he stood for. This verse actually is a summary of an assembly where Joshua delivered what we find in Joshua chapter 24, which is the book before Judges. See, Joshua knew his death was near, and he also knew that Israel would face a crossroads. And that's why he wrote these words in the last part of Joshua, the book of Joshua. Joshua 24, starting at verse 14. Very familiar passage. Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and truth. He is talking to a great assembly of the children of Israel. And he goes on and says, and put away the gods which your father served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And then he says this, if it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourself today who you will serve, whether it's the gods of your fathers, which were served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are now living. And then the most famous part of the whole text here. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You see, Joshua did not want them to drift spiritually. No. He wanted them to be intentional and stay focused in their relationship with God. And so when each tribe went their own direction and settled in the land, that moment signaled the end of a central leadership under Joshua. And according to the next verse, things went well, at least for a while. The next verse says, the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord, which he had done for Israel. According to this verse, Joshua and the elders who survived him were likely young men when they left Egypt. And that means that they would have witnessed God's power and promises firsthand. Likely they would have seen the Red Sea part. They would have tasted the manna that God provided for them every day in the desert. They may have very well felt the mist from the water as it poured out of the rock. They witnessed the Jordan River dry up as the feet of the priests stepped in. They saw the walls of Jericho come crashing down. They saw the sun stand still as they were fighting the Amorites. In fact, at that very moment, their feet were standing on the very land that God had promised to give to their forefathers. They were eating of the fruit from a land that God said flowed with milk and honey. In fact, they were living in houses that God promised they would not have to build. Can you just imagine what that would have been like? You see, these people at this time, their faith was alive and it was vibrant. And it was because it was anchored in a personal experience with the living God. They were eyewitnesses to the power, the provisions, and the promises of God. And while as a generation they were doing well, they knew that faith is just one generation from extinction. Well, that was the faithful generation in Joshua's day. They got it right, and they truly wanted the same for the next generation. However, that doesn't happen all by itself. And we see that in our last point, the unfaithful generation. Now, here's a hard truth that I think I have to share. Being faithful to God does not mean our children or grandchildren will be faithful to God. That's just a fact. Well, the next several verses, what we see is a transitional point. As we read earlier, each tribe of the nation of Israel began to live independently. Now, while this moment presents itself as a testament to God's faithfulness and Israel's obedience under Joshua, we also see that it sets the stage for the main reason they had to have the judges. In short, in verse 10, we see a foreshadowing of the spiritual drift that would last for the next several hundred years. Look with me at verse 10. All that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. Now, let me stop there just for a second. The phrase where it says here, that's the wrong verse. I'm sorry. There we go. My bad. The part that's underlined right there. Were gathered to their fathers. It simply means that the whole generation that would have been children at the Red Sea are all dead. They've all died. And so there is no one alive who could give a first-hand account of all that God had done. Now, I don't for a minute believe that next generation didn't know about those things that God had done for their forefathers. I mean, I'm sure they heard stories about the great exodus from Egypt, the Red Sea experience, how they crossed the Jordan River, and how the walls of Jericho came crashing down. I mean, they would have had to have known the stories. But for them, those acts of God were no longer precious. They were no longer central in their lives. They didn't make it a point to rejoice over those things, to remember those things, or even to recognize God's power, provision, and fulfilled promises. I believe they just simply forgot. Growing up, my family lived next door to my grandparents. And as a young boy, I spent a lot of time with my grandfather. And I remember him telling me stories about life in the Great Depression. I remember him telling me how he would jump on a train, a moving train, a regular cargo train in Derry, Pennsylvania, and ride it all the way down to West Virginia, where he would jump off that same moving train and then go into town and find work, whether it was at a coal mine or whatever. He would stay there for a couple of weeks, and then he would hop another train and do the same thing coming back. Those were great stories, and I enjoyed hearing them. But he also described there were other difficulties within the Great Depression, and he also told me how he got through them. They were great stories. But do you know how often I think about the Great Depression today? I don't. Well, I think that's what we see here in Judges chapter 2, verse 10. It's not that this generation after Joshua fought God. I think they forgot God. They did not know God relationally or personally. They knew about God, but that was it. Well, as a result, we read the following in verse 11. It says, "Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals." The Baals simply is the Canaanite word for the Lord. So this new generation clearly drifted. They forgot God to the point where they started serving false gods. Now, while we don't know how many generations passed between that faithful generation and the unfaithful generation, I think the deeper question is this: what happened? How did God's people drift from a faithful generation who served the Lord to an unfaithful generation who are now serving Canaanite gods? I mean, did one generation not pass on the faith, or did the next generation refuse to receive the faith? I'd say in light of our world today, I'd have to say it was both. You know, today there is a drift from one generation to the next. We see it in all kinds of areas. But the commitment in one generation has been replaced by complacency in the next. And then that complacency of that generation is replaced by compromise in the one to follow. And then that compromise of that generation, I believe, is being replaced by a complete rejection by many. And I think that's where we are today. Not just as a human race, but as Americans, and yes, even as Tyronians. And because of this drop-off, there is an important challenge in every generation of committed Christ followers. And it is this: we need to make sure that the foundations of faith are not forgotten. The ones who come after us need to be told those things. We need to remember that faith is just one generation from extinction. So, because that is true, what should you do? Well, honestly, because this same thing could be said about our family or our church, we need to be intentional to pass on the faith. Now, as I said at the start, nothing in life drifts where you want it to go. Your boat, your finances, your relationships, your health, everything important in life requires intentionality. And it's no different when it comes to the spiritual well-being of our children and our church. If you are not intentional, your children will drift away from God. So how do we do that? How do we become intentional? Well, fortunately, we are given some solid direction from a godly musician by the name of Asaph. Here's what he writes in Psalm 78. He, that's God, established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers that they should teach them to their children, that the generation to come might know, even the children yet to be born, that they may arise and tell them to their children, that they should put their confidence in God and not forget the words and works of God. See, that's God's strategy. If we want this next generation to follow after God, we must be a generation that intentionally teaches, molds, and lives out our faith in front of the very next generation. Look, we have a responsibility to the next generation. But before I get into that, I think we need to get honest with ourselves. So let me start by asking you a question. What you see here is 3 chairs that depict generations. Which generation would you say you are in? Are you in the committed generation, the complacent generation, or if we're being honest, you're more the compromising generation? Which chair are you sitting in? And if we were to ask your children, would they agree? See, what would your children say are your priorities? If I asked what is most important to mom and dad, what would they say? What would be number 1? Would it be the job? Would it be money? Would it be cars, a fancy house? Would it be a particular habit? Or worst case, an addiction? That's a tough question. What would your kids say? But here's something else. Sometimes we as parents can muddy the water without even really meaning to by the level of importance that we place on certain things. Things like where you're going to go to college. What sport are you going to play? What job do you see as your lifetime job? Your forever job? Now, while all those things have value, and there's nothing particularly wrong about each of them, I ask you this. Do you express the same level of importance in spiritual things? For example, do they know where they're going to spend eternity? Can they tell you how they know? Do they understand the importance of maintaining their walk with God? When was the last time that you prayed with your kids? The last time you prayed to God for more than just the food on the table in front of you? Have you ever shared your testimony? Do they know what God has done for you? Do you ever talk about God in your daily life and allow them to see how God impacts your life? Here's one more. When was the last time you served together, worshiped together, or even studied the Bible together with your children, with your grandkids? Look, you want to be seated in the committed chair. You have to know that you have a responsibility to pass on a committed faith to your children and grandchildren. And simply that's because the goal of a committed believer is to look for and use your time together as family to move your children from knowing the truth to living the truth. That's our biggest responsibility. And whether you're a parent who did it right or maybe didn't do it right, and for whatever reason your children have drifted away, I don't want you to get depressed. I want you to know this. God is still God. So instead of carrying guilt, you need to pray for your adult children. Lastly, as a church, I believe we have a responsibility to this next generation. And one of the core values of Hillside when it comes to our children's ministry, like I said earlier, is that we plant now so that we can harvest later. See, we want to make sure we remain intentional when it comes to preserving and passing on the gospel. So we have a thing called Kids Zone on Sunday morning. It's where our children hear the gospel in a way that's understandable and relatable. We have an EDGE program for our middle school students where those kids encounter questions of faith, and they do that in a small group with a leader. We have Vacation Bible School where for one time a year there are so many children that hear the gospel for the very first time. And we want to continue to make sure we have a youth group, because I think it's there where the teenagers are discipled and are helped and know how to become committed followers of Christ. And I can't forget this one. We want to make sure that we continue to have summer camp. I believe many teenagers experience dramatic life transformations during summer camp. You see, all those things are an opportunity for each of you to continue, to give, to pray, to volunteer, so that we can continue to plant now. I mean, just imagine the joy in seeing that harvest later. Kids and youth getting baptized, committing their lives to Jesus. Look, if we don't get this one thing right, we are going to lose the next generation. So here's the question I want to leave you with today. Will the next generation know Jesus because of us? Will they know? Will they know Jesus because of us? Will your children, will your grandchildren, your nieces and nephews, the kids in this church, will they know Jesus? And just to make it personal, will they know Jesus because you lived it, taught it, and modeled it? Or will they drift and forget? You see, faith does not pass itself on. We must be the bridge between what God has done for us and those who don't know him yet. So, where do you want to sit? Where are you currently sitting? You know, that last day on the lake produced some really, really great fishing until we drifted. Coincidentally, we are called to be fishers of men, and that would include our kids. So where do you want to drop anchor? Remember, faith is just one generation from extinction. Will you commit to be intentional when it comes to passing on your faith? I hope you will. You'll be glad you did. Let me pray for you as we close. Father God, I thank you, not just that you love us, but you pursue us, even when we pull up anchor and willfully walk away. Today we saw an example in your word of your children and how they drifted. And it wasn't intentional initially, but then it led to compromise and ultimately a complete rejection of you. We do not want that for this next generation. We want to help them. We want to be the bridge to their generation so that they stay faithful to you. So my prayer is that your Holy Spirit jumps into the hearts of the people that are hearing this today, and that you urge them to help, whether it's through prayer, whether it's through giving, whether it's through serving in children's ministry. All those things are vital to making the next generation remain faithful. It's not an easy thing for us to do. So we ask for your help, and I do that in your Son Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a blessed week.